It was an unusually balmy afternoon in Boston on January 15th, 1919. At least it was for the middle of winter. City dwellers in the North End neighborhood were out and about, either tending to their daily business or just enjoying the unseasonably warm weather, when a low and rumbling groan filled the streets. The ground quivered below their feet, and a shadow cast over their faces, as a wall of dark sludge came cascading down the roads and alleyways, taking anything and anyone in its path as hostage to its current. This is the story of how 21 people lost their lives, and another 150 were injured in what's become known as the Great Molasses Flood of 1919. Hey there, and welcome back to LukieSpooks, or if this is your first time, well then, just welcome. My name is Luke, and I'm here to deliver to you all things strange, spooky, and spiritually suspicious. And today we're going to be focusing more on the strange. I recently came across an article about non-water floods. So floods that had disastrous or not so disastrous effects that didn't involve water. Like the London beer flood of 1814, or the Wisconsin butter flood of 1991, or the Pepsi fruit juice flood in Russia. Yeah, all those are real things. But the real doozy on that list was the Great Molasses Flood, also known as the Boston Molasses Disaster of 1919. It sounds like something that would only happen at Santa's factory. Like a Pixar movie. A negligent elf causes a syrup tsunami that takes out the entire North Pole.
Christmas is canceled.
But no, this really happened in Boston and people died. And some even say that you can still smell the sweet aroma of molasses on a hot day in the North End. But is it true? We're actually going to get into the neuroscience behind the legend. A lot of information for this one was found from the work of author and historian Stephen Puleo, who literally wrote the book on the whole thing. But please let me know if I missed something, as always. Especially if you're a Bostonian. Really not trying to disrespect any Bostonians. So with all that being said, grab your goggles and a wet wipe, because we're going to be riding this dark and sticky tide right into the Boston Harbor. The North End is a neighborhood in Boston, smaller than a square mile, that's bordered by the Charles River in the Boston Harbor. But in order to really understand the importance and magnitude of this surreal disaster, we have to understand what the North End neighborhood really was in the early 1900s. At the time, it was maybe one of the most congested areas in the US, with about 40,000 people crammed into that less than square mile. And since most of the Irish had moved out by 1919, over 90% of the population was comprised of Italian immigrants. And these immigrants rarely sought citizenship because it was such a long and grueling process. So only about 40% of the North End were actually citizens. As was common for many groups at the time, the Italians faced heavy discrimination. The North End was one of the few places they were able to live. And based on the dense population and quite poor living conditions, it was basically considered a slum. But all of these factors just made the Italians grow closer together and form a very tight-knit and familial community, a sentiment which remains strong even to this day.
There's something about it, especially when you grew up here and to kind of relive it again.
It's still that old world community.
It's homey.
It's authentic.
It's perfect.
I like everything here in North End.
Back in the mid-1910s, the obvious thing happening on the global map was World War I, and a lot of industries were adapting to the war needs in order to make a profit. So you're probably wondering, what do the North End of Boston and war needs have to do with molasses? Well, in order to understand that, let's just all make sure we actually understand what molasses is. Molasses. It's one of those words that we hear in idioms, and it's fun to say, but you might not really know what it is. So real briefly, molasses is actually a byproduct of sugar refining. It's sticky, brown, and viscous, which is just a fancy word to describe a thick liquid. It's a thick syrup. And it's absolutely rich in vitamins and minerals, and has a lot of different uses, most obviously cooking. But molasses can also be fermented, meaning that its sugar can be converted into an alcohol, not only for beverages, but for industrial uses as well. Now, molasses had already been a long-standing staple of the Massachusetts economy since the colonial days. But now, with the huge war going on, companies could use that molasses to make ethanol, a type of alcohol which was a key component for manufacturing explosives. This is where the Purity Distilling Company comes into the picture. These are the big bad guys. They are the negligent elf in our not real Pixar movie. Except in our fake movie, the negligent elf probably had some good intentions, and I don't think the same can be said about the Purity Distilling Company. Very ironic name. The Purity Distilling Company was situated along Commercial Street, near the harbor, right outside of the North End neighborhood. Seeing the immense amount of profit they could make from the war effort by distilling their own molasses down to ethanol, plans were hastily drawn and implemented to construct a 50-foot tall by 90-foot wide tank, which would have the capacity to store 2.3 million gallons of molasses. But y'all, I did not understand the size of this tank until I saw this picture. This thing was huge. And FYI, molasses weighs about 12 pounds per gallon. So there's 2.3 million of those in that tank. Damn. Now, our Italian friends in the North End were not happy about this. They were already living in tough enough conditions, and the construction and presence of this tank was not going to help. But remember, most of the residents of the North End weren't citizens, meaning they couldn't vote. And in general, they just didn't have a voice about anything that went on in their neighborhood. So with very little pushback and very little oversight, this colossal molasses tank went up in 1915. And when I say very little oversight, I mean there was no inspection of materials and no engineers were consulted. The whole project was headed by the company's accountant, Arthur Gell, who had zero architectural or engineering experience. What could possibly go wrong? The whole thing was a complete rush job. Arthur Gell felt immense pressure to have the project finished and cut every corner possible in order for the distillery to be ready for that first shipment of molasses by the last day of the year. And Gell would technically meet that deadline, because ready or not, that tank would be receiving its first load of 1.3 million gallons of molasses on December 31st, 1915. And from the very start of the tank's use, the cracks began to show, literally. Molasses would trickle down the side of the tank with such regularity that the neighborhood kids would bring buckets to collect the syrup and bring it home as a sweet treat. The residents of North End even became used to hearing groans and low rumblings emanating from the tank. Within a couple years, the Purity Distilling Company would be bought by the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, and it would continue to function at this precarious capacity. But that's not to say there weren't complaints about safety and structural integrity until the day the tank ruptured. But Arthur Gell just couldn't be bothered. No time could be wasted addressing concerns that could hinder making profits. And people kept complaining about the obvious molasses leaks, and Arthur Gell's response was just to paint the tank brown. Problem solved. And when Isaac Gonzalez, the on-site manager for the tank, continued to have his worries and concerns brushed aside, he eventually quit. And that decision just may have saved his life. 4 months after Isaac Gonzalez left his position at USIA, within a couple days of January 15th, 1919, the company was scheduled to receive a big, fat new shipment of molasses. Now, this is all alleged and can't be proven, but the Prohibition Law, the one that would make drinking alcohol illegal, was set to be ratified only a few days later on January 16th, 1919. So perhaps USIA was especially eager to receive this new batch in an effort to outrun the impending Prohibition Law? Regardless, the distillery would receive this fresh shipment of warm, gooey molasses, which would top off the already partially filled tank containing cold molasses. And that huge molasses tank was now a ticking time bomb. The late morning and early afternoon of January 15th, 1919 was honestly quite perfect. The residents in the North End of Boston were eager to get out and enjoy the unseasonably warm day, since the 40-degree weather felt balmy compared to the single digits they had just been dealing with. The already congested neighborhood was even more bustling than usual, with the sound of cars rumbling by, business owners and laborers in conversation. and children shouting while chasing each other up and down the streets. Down near the harbor, patrolman Frank McManus stood mid-shift on Commercial Street. The day felt just a bit easier without the bitter cold. But then, around 12:40, the ground beneath him started to shudder. Brown liquid started surrounding him. At first, he thought it was probably just a ruptured water main, or maybe mud sliding from a construction site nearby. Honestly, he was at a loss. But then Frank turned his head. The molasses tank, or what had been of the tank, had burst open. A tidal wave of thick, brown, sticky sludge surged toward him. It wasn't water. And that saying, slower than cold molasses in January, well, that's not what Frank witnessed at all. This dark tide was moving fast. He barely missed the worst of it as he bolted up a side street. Molasses lapping at his boots, covering his hat and his uniform and his hands. Robert Bennett was enjoying a quiet meal with his family in his home just opposite the molasses tank. And they actually had a view of an elevated railway that ran right above Commercial Street. Feeling that rumble just like Frank McManus, Bennett thought it was just a passing train on the elevated railway, until he heard a loud swish like the sound of rushing air. Then just darkness, like a giant shadow had been cast over everything. And then he saw it. A giant black wave coming straight for his family. But according to Bennett, it didn't seem to rush. In his own words, it just rolled slowly, like the side of a mountain falling into space. But as the sticky wave got closer, he realized just how fast it was actually moving. His family had just enough time to run away before the windows began to crack and molasses poured in. The Bennetts ran to their front door thinking that escape would be in the streets, but when they opened the door, they saw that the molasses had already risen up the front steps. So they turned around and hightailed it up to the roof. Local barman Martin Clawforty, he was fast asleep on the third floor of his home on Cops Hill Terrace along Commercial Street when he was awoken by the deep rumble. Before he was even fully conscious, Clawforty was already surrounded by multiple feet of a dark substance, thinking that he had, quote, gone overboard. Without even realizing his bed was floating in molasses, he used it as a raft and was able to rescue his sister as his home crumbled around him. Unfortunately, his mother and younger brother didn't survive. These are just some of the personal stories that highlight what it must have been like for those unexpected North Enders during those initial moments of the Boston Molasses Disaster. Having no idea what was going on or what this substance was that was just careening through their entire neighborhood. The individual reports of what people experienced are widespread. Some heard an explosion, some didn't. Some heard a seething, hissing sound as the molasses rolled by. It really just depended on where you were and what state of mind you were in. But one thing was absolutely certain. The 50 by 90 foot molasses tank had ruptured, unleashing 2.3 million gallons of dark, brown, sticky sludge that tore through the streets of Boston. Various sources report various numbers, but according to Stephen Puleo, the author of Dark Tide, the initial wave of molasses measured to be about 35 feet high and flowed at a rate of 35 miles per hour. Just take a second to imagine that. It might not relatively seem that fast, but our bodies getting hit by anything of substance at 35 miles an hour is going to do some major damage. But anyway, that initial wave would level off to about 20 feet high and 160 feet wide, cutting a swath of destruction in its path before everything settled. Now, just a little bit of physics to help us understand what was really happening because, again, this is very hard to conceptualize, especially because all of the footage we have is of the aftermath. Now, molasses behaves as a non-Newtonian liquid, meaning that its viscosity or runniness changes based on the amount and type of pressure it's experiencing. And this change in behavior depends on the type of liquid in question. A great example of this is cornstarch mixed with water, and you may have seen or done this experiment. When you let the mixture do its thing and don't apply force, it's nice and runny. But when you apply a brief moment of high force, it behaves like a solid. Well, molasses actually behaves the opposite. As all of that molasses was flowing out of the tank and running down the streets, it was experiencing a shear force, which caused it to become thinner and runnier and allowed it to move much faster than expected. Or at least a lot faster than cold molasses in January. And we discussed earlier that 1 gallon of molasses weighs 12 pounds, so that's an extremely dense liquid. So add in just the weight factor of 2.3 million gallons of molasses, and it's just no question as to how this tidal wave was so destructive. Any physicists out there, please holler. The Boston Globe reported that right beforehand, people were, quote, picked up by a rush of air and hurled many feet. Debris was thrusted at bystanders from this blast of sweet-smelling air. Then came the dense tidal wave, when, as the Boston Globe reported, buildings cringed up as though they were made of pasteboard. The nearby Engine 31 firehouse was knocked clean off its foundation, causing the second story to collapse onto its first. The entire north end paving yard was demolished. And with that tank right next to the elevated railway on Commercial Street, well, the powerful wave had enough force to drive steel panels from the burst tank against the supports of the railway, causing massive destruction. Acting just in time, the operator was able to stop any railway cars from falling into the molasses pit below. Nothing was a match for this moving wall of syrup. Multiple houses were just completely leveled. 2 cars that were 30 feet from the tank were picked up and thrown like toys into lampposts. People who were unfortunate enough to be anywhere near the tank when it ruptured were either killed or smothered immediately by the wave. There's a story of 3 children, 8-year-old Antonio D'Estasio, his sister Maria, and their friend Pasquale Iantosca, who were gathering firewood for their families that day, probably a little less reluctant to do so because of the nice weather. But the firewood was right next to the molasses tank when it fell apart, and all 3 children were swallowed by its current. Sadly, Maria and Pasquale would not survive the disaster. Maria was immediately suffocated by the molasses, and Pasquale was thrown into a railway car. But thankfully, Antonio D'Estasio would survive. But he suffered a severe head injury by being flung into a light post. Almost as rapidly as the 20 to 35 foot tidal wave pummeled through the north end, the dark sticky goo would start to recede, revealing a half-mile wide swath of crushed buildings, crumpled bodies, and 2 to 3 feet of sludge. And the molasses started to become thicker due to its slowing momentum and the cold temperatures. If a north ender had been lucky enough to evade the force of the initial wave or any of the debris that it was carrying, well, they were still at risk of being trapped and suffocated by the sticky goo. And if all of this is hard to imagine, a Boston reporter at the time helps paint a grisly and graphic picture. Molasses, waist deep, covered the street and swirled and bubbled around the wreckage. Here and there struggled a form. Whether it was an animal or human being was impossible to tell. That image is just haunting. An entire neighborhood covered in this dark blanket, and you just have no idea what's what. The entire north end had turned into one giant fly trap, and time was of the essence to rescue those trapped under debris and literally drowning in syrup. The initial threat of the molasses flood was over before anyone even had a chance to realize what had happened. Destroyed businesses and homes, mangled metal, overturned carriages, horses and people stuck in molasses, which was getting thicker and heavier and colder every moment in the January air. The first 15 minutes after the tank ruptured was absolute chaos. Shouts and screams from the injured and dying echoed through the cold north end air. Horses trapped in the mess panicked and flailed trying to escape the goo. But the more they struggled, the deeper ensnared they became. And tragically, dogs too. Again, the Boston Globe did a hauntingly good job describing the scene. That underneath this dark molasses blanket, quote, only an upheaval, a thrashing about in the sticky mass showed where any life was. But reports also say that rescue efforts were dispatched within minutes. And if there's one thing I know about Bostonians, it's that they are tough, regardless of the generation. and they will run straight into danger to help someone. And January 15th of 1919 was an early example of this. Several people recount that anyone who wasn't already trapped was ready and willing to dive into the quicksand like molasses to help someone out. At the same time, over 100 sailors from the nearby Navy ship USS Nantucket ran several blocks toward the disaster, wading knee-deep through the syrup to try and pull out survivors. They were quickly joined by the Boston Police, Red Cross, Army, and Navy personnel. Some nurses dove straight into the molasses, while others helped tend to the injured and the first responders, making sure they were comfortable and warm. Broken backs, broken pelvises, and fractured skulls were all common injuries. The most dramatic rescue took place at the Engine 31 firehouse. Several firemen who were enjoying a lunchtime card game when the tank ruptured became trapped in a molasses-flooded pocket when the second floor collapsed on top of the first. Workers finally freed the survivors after multiple hours of cutting away floorboards and debris. But during his fight for survival, 38-year-old George Leahy lost his strength and drowned. The flood occurred at 12:40 p.m., and by 1 p.m. it was reported that 100 to 150 people had been removed from the scene. But rescuers continued to work into the night, even though the molasses became harder and harder to navigate, making the rescue efforts incredibly difficult. The injured were so numerous that doctors set up a temporary relief center at a nearby Haymarket to start triaging survivors without having to transport them too far. By midnight, the death toll had risen to 11 people. Over the next 4 days, rescuers would do whatever they could to help extract and recover bodies from the molasses. Some victims were so glazed in syrup that they were nearly impossible to recognize. Those ensnared horses were taken out of their misery by using bullets. The search effort eventually ended as the molasses had become too difficult to wade through. But the death toll would continue to rise over the following days and even months, as the injured would succumb to their wounds and bodies would continue to be recovered. Some victims had even been swept into the Boston Harbor, like wagon driver Cesare Nicolo, who wasn't found until almost 4 months after the flood. The human toll of the Great Molasses Flood would rise to 21 who lost their lives and another 150 who were injured. The victims were a mix of laborers and working-class residents of the North End, just trying to make a better life for themselves and their families. Many were employed by the North End paving yard, while others were teamsters, blacksmiths, firefighters, drivers, or simply bystanders. But there were children too, like little Maria and Pasquale, who we talked about earlier. And like with so many other disasters, this shocked and shattered community, or what was left of it, now had to figure out how to move on after this tragedy. Several blocks of the North End were now completely covered in 2 to 3 feet of hardening molasses. According to Stephen Pulio, the flood had extended all the way down Commercial Street to Battery Wharf, and the extent of damage and loss of life could have been even worse if it wasn't for Copp's Hill Terrace, which protected the heart of the North End neighborhood from the onslaught of the ruptured tank. Cleaning up the sticky debris and making the North End livable again proved to be a monumental task. Debris-filled molasses had seeped into every basement, underneath every floor, and filled every pocket it encountered. The syrup tsunami resulted in $500,000 worth of damages, which would be almost $10 million in 2025. The city attempted to wash away the molasses using regular water, but it just wouldn't budge. However, it was eventually discovered that salt water had the power to dissolve this tenacious molasses. So over the next weeks, a fireboat was used to pump seawater into the area, which was then blasted onto the glazed wreckage and streets. Sand was used to help absorb the dissolved syrup, while the leftovers and chunks of molasses drained back into the Boston Harbor. Within 2 days, the harbor had turned brown from the dark syrup as over 300 workers continued to carve through the glaze, and it stayed that way until summer. Should have thrown in some tea bags in there too. And don't be misled, the North End wasn't the only neighborhood affected by this molasses flood. Rescue workers, cleanup crews, and curious onlookers had tracked molasses through the streets and spread it to subway platforms, to the seats inside trains and streetcars, to pay telephone handsets, then into their homes, and everywhere in between. Even now, in response to the event, people will say that everything a Bostonian touched at the time was sticky. And the molasses. It obviously got into every nook and cranny and proved to be a very tenacious material, so it's impossible that every single drop was cleaned up. And it's confirmed that in the 1960s, gas meter readers were able to still smell molasses when they went into basements to read these meters. And legend says that to this day, you can still smell the sweet aroma of molasses wafting through the air on a hot summer day in Boston. But stick around to the end because we actually might have a definitive answer to this. Today, the area that was formerly home to the distilling company, its Goliath Molasses Tank, and the North End Paving Yard, is now a beautiful recreation area comprised of Langone and Puopolo parks. But the time between the molasses flood and today was filled with lawsuits, humanitarian battles, and a complete reform of civil engineering regulation. We already talked about some of the obvious reasons for the flood earlier on. The hasty construction of the molasses tank, the complete lack of testing, and the complete disregard for any of the concerns raised since the very first day of its use. It only took a month after the disaster for an initial inquisition to determine that the entire blame lay on the United States Industrial Alcohol Company. The tank's integrity was already questionable. Then, on the day of the disaster, the higher than normal temperatures resulted in an increased pressure on the tank. Then, on top of that, the tank had just been filled with warm molasses. Again, increasing the pressure, but also making the molasses much runnier. Then, there's the whole fact that some fermentation was probably already taking place in the tank, meaning that carbon dioxide was building up. And what does that do? You guessed it!
It increases the pressure.
And recent investigations are still discovering new details as to why this disaster happened. In 2014, it was found that the steel used to fabricate the tank was significantly thinner than what was required for such a large structure, and the company used a cheaper version of steel that was more brittle. Also, the rivets used on the tank were found to be flawed. The eventual failure occurred at a manhole cover near the base of the tank, and it's possible that an existing fatigue crack in that area grew until the point of rupture. In 2016, researchers at Harvard concluded that the reports of the high speed of the flood were credible, not only after compiling a mountain of data in first-person reports, but by studying the behavior of cold corn syrup flooding a scale model of the affected neighborhood. But the North Enders in 1919 wouldn't need a fancy study to validate their experiences that day, and it wouldn't change the losses that they would have to endure. After that initial inquest, a grand jury led to 0 indictments of USIA's employees on the basis of a lack of evidence. They technically hadn't broken any laws because there were no laws. But that wouldn't be the end of the fight. 119 claims against USIA from individuals and family members of those lost were combined into one of the earliest and largest class action lawsuits in Massachusetts. And in 1925, 6 years after the tragedy, Judge Hugh Ogden officially ruled that the U.S. Industrial Alcohol Company shouldered the entire blame for the flood and its casualties. And the trial highlighted the gross negligence of Arthur Gell, the accountant who let all of this happen without the oversight of one single expert. The whole thing could have been prevented. And thankfully, Judge Ogden was not buying the defense's argument that the molasses tank had been blown up by Italian immigrant anarchists because the distillery was supporting war munitions manufacturing. In the end, the United States Industrial Alcohol Company paid out $628,000 in damages to the victims of the Boston Molasses Disaster, which would be over $11 million in 2025. This would be about $7,000 per victim, or over $125,000 in 2025. One of the biggest consequences of the Great Molasses Flood was how it spurred significant improvements in construction regulation. Engineering certification laws were enacted requiring professional oversight and quality checks at multiple stages. So yeah, now you need a license to do this shit. And Judge Ogden's clear stance against USIA, and not to mention the flood itself, instituted a monumental shift in the country's attitude towards big business. which for much of the early 1900s got away with cutting corners thanks to a system that turned a blind eye. So these new laws were first passed in Massachusetts, but quickly spread across the United States, forcing a level of accountability to keep the public safe that previously was basically non-existent. Which is great, because these laws are why the chances of us perishing in Final Destination-like tragedies are significantly reduced today. And nuances aside, we are much safer because of these regulations, even though it took a freak molasses flood to enforce the point. But the red tape and the laws and the regulations wouldn't bring back the North Enders that were lost on January 15th, 1919. And it wouldn't heal the wounds of those who had actually lived through the horror and were left to pick up the pieces. Because when you zoom in past the lawsuits and headlines, what you really see is a neighborhood, specifically Boston's Italian-American community, that was hit the hardest and left with the least. And remember, this community was already marginalized. Most of them had left a life of hardship in southern Italy in order to find better opportunities in the US, only to be heavily discriminated against. They never even wanted the damn tank in the first place. But also, remember that this was a community rich in love, culture, and generosity. They were family, and they took care of each other. And they would continue to share meals, telling stories to keep the memories alive of those that were no longer with them. And the Italian-American immigrants, like so many others, would continue to experience discrimination for a long time. But it strengthened their resolve. They didn't just pick up and leave after the flood. The flood brought them closer together and became a major catalyst for change in the Italian-American community, showing the need to claim and establish their voice in politics. Over the next 20 years, the number of Italian-American voters tripled in Boston, and after World War II, they would become a major force in Massachusetts politics. Their history forged a community and neighborhood that, over the decades, would find stability and prosperity. Ask a Bostonian today, and most are going to know about this disaster. They grew up with the stories, or have an odd connection with the place, or a family member that actually experienced it. They understand how important it is to Boston's history and the rest of the country.
Have you ever heard of the Great Molasses Flood?
Yes, it's over 100 years old now.
Sure, that happened on Commercial Street.
Where it spilled is actually where I used to have recess.
My grandmother always spoke of it because she was a little girl when it happened, and she remembered it.
And there's like a whole society of people dedicated to elucidating and time capsulating every detail about that day. Studying how and why the flood happened, confronting the physics, telling the personal stories, fully understanding the socio-political context at the time. They continue to have meetings and conferences and memorials to explain, teach, and share new findings. And the business and residential layout of the North End today is not that much different than it was in 1919, although the area where the distillery was looks vastly different. The only real sign of the disaster and what used to be there is a small plaque at the entrance of Puopolo Park, dedicated to the event and those who lost their lives. Ground-penetrating radar was used to try and identify the exact location of where the original molasses tank used to stand. And the giant concrete slab that was the base of the tank was discovered about 2 feet underneath the baseball diamond in Langone Park. A memorial was held at the park for the 100th anniversary in 2019, where attendees stood in a circle marking the edge of the tank and read the names of the 21 North Enders who lost their lives in the Great Molasses Flood. And if you ask a Bostonian today, or more specifically a North Ender, you'll get a mixed response as to whether or not they think you can still smell molasses on a hot day.
And it's been a long time.
You can still smell the sweet molasses. I smell it, and I've been smelling it since I was a little kid.
It's smelling a little molassesy right now.
I can't say I ever have.
Not that I've noticed.
I think they're wrong. So.
We know that the molasses could still be smelled in 1960 by those gas meter readers. But would this really be possible today? I love the science behind these things, so please humor me while I break this down a little bit. When we smell something, we're sensing volatile molecules, basically meaning molecules that break away from whatever smells and float into the air, and activate special cells way up in our schnozzes called olfactory neurons. And then higher processes in our brain interpret these activated neurons into a perceived scent. But there are also a lot of other brain processes happening at the same time. And the sense of smell is highly susceptible to suggestion. What you smell really depends on the context and your expectations. So if you're expecting to smell something, often your ability to detect that scent and understand it is really heightened. It's almost like a superpower for humans, in terms of being able to make predictions about what we're going to experience based on our expectations. And one neuroscientist explained it as a feature of our brains and not so much a bug. But it could mean that maybe we're either talking or thinking ourselves into smelling molasses. Regardless, the urban legend aspect of this lingering molasses scent is a very powerful manipulator. If one person says that they can smell it, then it's much more likely that someone else will say the same thing. It goes back to the whole expectations thing. But here's the really cool part. It's not that these people are just making up that they're smelling molasses. They could be smelling something, or maybe even nothing. But with all the other added context and expecting to smell something and being primed by others, well, that signals to the brain that you are actually smelling molasses. So all the same neural pathways are being activated, whether the scent is actually there or not. And the greater implications of this in psychology and neuroscience are fascinating, but that's a whole nother rabbit hole itself. And although it is fallible, it's our brains running on super efficiency in order to make sense of the barrage of sensory input from our world. But aside from all this hoopla, is it really possible to smell the actual molasses from 1919? Well, the science says it's plausible. Remember, that molasses seeped into every possible space, so there could be pockets somewhere that release the sweet scent on a hot summer day. Also, some of the aromatic molecules in molasses take a long time to break away and become smellable, like vanillin. So it is possible that these scents are being released very slowly over time. And the whole trope that humans have poor noses, well, we can detect some molecules up to 1 part in a billion. So we should give ourselves some credit. My mom will love that fact because that woman has a nose like a bloodhound. Speaking of, some people do just have a stronger sense of smell than others. So maybe it's just the super smellers that are picking up on the scent of molasses. I feel like all these explanations are great and basically cover all the bases. And although I agree that this is definitely plausible, it would be really hard to rule out the sweet smells coming from one of the top-notch bakeries in the area. But what do you think? Can any Bostonians weigh in on their experiences? Well, that, my sticky Tide Riders, is the crazy, unbelievable, and heartbreaking story of the Great Molasses Flood. And when I tell you that I still cannot believe how huge that tank was. Like, this was not just a large vat of syrup that I had previously imagined. It's a story that sounds like an urban legend. I think part of the reason it's easy to sensationalize and reduce down to a headline is because it's so easy to focus on the ridiculousness of molasses being the killer. But there is such a larger picture behind the freak accident itself. The killer was corporate greed. The victims were a disenfranchised group that became flies in a trap, almost literally. The result was a complete reform of engineering standards, but also a broken community that would become galvanized over the following decades. 21 lives were taken that day in 1919, without their choice, so the rest of us could learn how to build better and safer systems. So it's important to say that those lives were not lost in vain. And what happened on January 15th, 1919 in the north end of Boston will never be forgotten. And to end on a positive note, which you know I like to do, my last takeaway, which I got from the whole "can you still smell the molasses" thing, is that it's all about the RAS, also known as the reticular activating system. I'm about to go neuro on you again, but just hear me out, we're almost there. But the RAS pathway is a brain system that plays a pivotal role in that common experience, where, for instance, you think of a red car, or you buy a red car, and suddenly you see a ton of red cars. It's not that there are actually more red cars. Your brain is now just primed for them, and it places importance on them, so you're more likely to notice them. like the smell of molasses, perhaps. But all that I'm getting at, you might have heard this, but if we actually decide to focus on the positive things, or the good things in life, then we really are much more likely to notice those things throughout our day. And if we keep working at that and decide to focus on the positive thoughts about ourselves instead of the negative, or believe that we actually can do certain things, well then we can actually start to live that out and actually do those things. And I know it sounds trite, but it's neuroscience, baby. Anyway, that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching this video, especially if you hung out for the whole thing. And I'd really love to know your thoughts, especially if you're a Bostonian and any of this resonated with you. And if I got anything wrong, please don't beat me up. If you enjoyed this video, then your likes and comments would mean the world so that my videos and channel can continue to reach others. And if you like what we're doing over here at LukieSpooks, then my boss would be forever grateful if you subscribed. And by boss, I mean my cat, Shiba. Anyway, thanks again, stay safe, stay away from 2.3 million gallon molasses tanks at all costs, and as always, stay spooky.